Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is June 1st, day 604 of the war. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military correspondent, Emanuel Fabian. Hi, Manny. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda.
Despite President Trump's optimism on Friday, it does not appear that hostage release negotiations and a ceasefire are really on the horizon for the near future. So Manny will tell us what's going on the ground in Gaza, as well as airstrikes that were launched against Syria over the weekend. We'll also hear about really amazing new technology that warded off dozens, if not hundreds, of Hezbollah drones with lasers. So all of this and more when we're back.
The law basically assumes that the enemy force you are fighting may not care about your civilians, but it certainly cares about its own civilians. What do we do in a reality where you're dealing with an enemy that the suffering of their civilian population is inherent to their war strategy? Now, that doesn't absolve us of our obligations. Hamas's inhumanity does not absolve us of the obligation for humanity. But the context that it creates, I think, is critical to the conversation, and it's very lacking.
I agree, but when democracies fight back against terror groups, they have to fight on two fronts. They have to both fight on the terms that have been laid out by the terror group, and the second thing you have to fight back is by preserving the norms of a democracy. We're forced to ask these moral questions about what we are and what we do, but based on an enemy that is not playing by the rules. But that's what we decide to be a part of by being the family of nations. And as Jews, we say, like every morning in our prayers, we say, "Anachnu b'nei britecha," we choose to be the people of God's covenant, meaning we tie ourselves to an aspiration of justice and righteousness.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military reporter, Emanuel Fabian. Last night, we heard confirmation that Hamas head Muhammad Sinwar was indeed killed in strikes about a month ago. Manny, can you update us on what we know now? What is the IDF basing its confirmation on?
So the army has finally obtained the intelligence, basically, to confirm that the strike on May 13 on a tunnel that ran underneath the European hospital at Khan Yunis did indeed kill Muhammad Sinwar, along with two other very senior Hamas military commanders. We're talking about Muhammad Shabana, who's the commander of the Rafah Brigade, and Mahdi Kurara, who is the commander of the South Khan Yunis Battalion. The army, I'll say this, within the constraints that I can, is the army's operating very close to that area now. It's pushed into Khan Yunis. It's ordered all of Khan Yunis to evacuate. So it wouldn't surprise me if this sort of intelligence was also obtained, possibly also from the ground, or maybe in other ways. But the army is operating very close to that area, very close to the hospital, at least according to Palestinian media. The strike itself, I think, is important to note. The army is now revealing that it dropped around 50 munitions, 50 bombs within 30 seconds on this tunnel system. So that's really quite a lot. It's very similar to how Nasrallah was killed, actually, in Beirut, with sort of a very large amount of bombs dropped within a very short amount of time. And what is even more interesting is if you look at pictures from the hospital, or even the satellite images, or the army released also drone images showing the before and after, you can see that the hospital was not damaged at all, actually, on the strike. So these bombs basically hit the tunnel, the roots of the tunnel around the hospital. You can see there's one that hit the courtyard, there's one that hit an access road, but not the building itself. So the building is intact and continued to operate after the strike. And essentially it collapsed the tunnel at all the main sort of the junctions of the tunnel, and basically killing anybody inside. And even following that strike on May 13, for the following 3 or 4 days afterwards, the army carried out strikes in the area, preventing anyone from getting close to the tunnel, to basically ensure that anyone who was inside was indeed actually killed. I also note that when this strike was carried out, the army made sure that there was no hostages being kept next to these senior officials, because previously they did indeed have hostages with them. We've heard this from hostages who have come back, they've said that they were actually with or next to these top Hamas commanders.
So these 50 munitions were released in really a rapid fire manner. And how much aircraft was used in the strike? Do you have any idea, Manny?
I can do the math. If it was within 30 seconds, the army hasn't said, but if it was within 30 seconds, then we're talking probably maybe 8 aircraft in this case. If you
Really?
kind of factor in how many bombs are on each plane, yeah.
So let's turn to right now the claims from the IDF that Hamas is losing control, somewhat in light, or maybe directly in light, of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation aid program, which is attempting to step up efforts in feeding the Gazans in the southern Gaza Strip, at least. I'm not sure if it's started in the north yet, but Manny, the reports from this effort are so conflicting, meaning we're hearing, of course, about IDF shooting into crowds. We're hearing from Gazans that up to, I think, 10, the number is right now, that's being thrown around by the Hamas-run health ministry, that 10 have died within this aid effort. So it's very difficult to make order out of the differing reports that we're hearing, especially since the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has been a little opaque in its efforts, I would say. So, Manny, what are you hearing?
So, really, right now, the Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, has been saying that nobody has died, at least in the past 5 days, in their centers, and the army has said that it's only fired warning shots. And so we're not really sure. There's even reports from this morning that 30 people were killed near one of the aid distribution sites. As of recording, we haven't heard from the army, but we've heard these sort of claims in the previous days where people have been killed in those areas, and the army and the foundation have both sort of denied shooting at anybody directly. So it's all a bit confusing, but the defense official who spoke to reporters on Friday said that a lot of this is actually part of Hamas's efforts to sort of delegitimize the whole aid distribution site, because the new aid distribution, of course, cuts off Hamas from the aid. And Israel sees this in a way where, if you cut Hamas off the aid, then that also cuts the population off of Hamas. And that weakens their civil rule in Gaza, which is one of the goals of the war, which is to dismantle Hamas's civil rule. So it sort of serves that effort. So Israel recognizes that Hamas is trying to prevent this aid distribution system from going ahead. It's threatened Palestinians who have tried to go there. It set up checkpoints at one point. We saw the army is trying to get this aid distribution system sort of ramped up even further. There's even plans to build more sites. Right now they're in Rafah and in the Netzarim corridor area. But it is seeing that because of so many Palestinians are going to these sites and not listening to Hamas, Israel sees this as some sort of sign of Hamas's weakened control in Gaza, how all these civilians are flocking to these sites, and it basically undermines Hamas's government in the area. But personally, I think it maybe is a little bit too early to tell. This aid distribution system's only been going for a week now, so we don't really know the full effect of it yet. But I mean, going back to just before we talked about Sinwar, Hamas has almost no senior officials left in Gaza anymore. Israel's killed the vast majority of their leadership, at least the leadership that was there on October 7th. And we are seeing in Gaza, there was protests a few weeks ago against Hamas. We're now seeing thousands of Palestinians going to these aid distribution sites. I think there is something going on here where Hamas's civil rule is definitely weakened. Is it getting to the point where the government there is overthrown entirely? I don't think so, but we could be at the start of something here.
We're still seeing rockets being fired from Gaza. They still have the capacity to fire rockets, and they're still using them. And we've talked about this before, that often they'll shoot rockets right before the IDF reaches a certain area where the rockets are held. And I just wonder if you feel like there's some kind of parallel here between these reports, at least, of Gazans being killed in this aid effort, that it's just a last throws kind of situation. But perhaps I'm reading too much into it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe that it could be related. I don't really know the veracity of these reports yet of Palestinians being killed at the aid sites, but if they are true, then I'm sure the army will investigate and release a comment as to what happened. But if they're not, then it wouldn't surprise me that this is just part of a Hamas effort to try and sort of delegitimize the aid distribution system. And not helping the whole thing is also the UN, and this is what the defense official said, is that the UN has been publicly against the new aid distribution system. It's not supportive of it. We've heard this from the UN publicly, and the defense official has said that the UN is being very uncooperative when it comes to, distributing aid in Gaza, and it's basically not helping the situation right now. And yeah, Israel really wants to see this system succeed and eventually reach a point where the food entering Gaza exclusively goes through these new aid distribution sites.
Okay, let's talk about what's happening on the ground a little bit more. And on Thursday, a 19-year-old defense contractor was killed. His name is David Libi. And I just wonder, why are we using these defense contractors here?
So much of the army operations in Gaza now is actually destroying buildings. The buffer zone that Israel established initially was a kilometer into Gaza. It's now been expanded to 2 kilometers. And the whole Rafah area is now considered a new buffer zone. And if you want to control a buffer zone and ensure that troops aren't, attacked from anywhere, then you have to destroy the buildings in those areas because they pose a threat. Hamas can hide in the building and open fire from them. That's the justification, of course. There are, of course, many, and even people in the Israeli government who say that we have to destroy the buildings because we're taking revenge against Hamas. But the army says the justification is because it's a threat to ground troops. Now, to demolish all these buildings takes a lot of effort, and combat engineers, Israel doesn't have that. The army doesn't have that many combat engineers. It only has a certain amount, and they're busy mostly dealing with tunnels, which are much more complicated engineering sort of activity to try and locate and demolish them. To free up the combat engineers, the Defense Ministry has been hiring civilians with construction experience to carry out relatively simple and relatively low-risk demolition tasks in Gaza, mainly in the areas closest to the border, in the buffer zone, and basically to free up the IDF units who would otherwise carry out that task. So numerous civilians have been hired for this task. So David Libi is really the third civilian defense ministry contractor who's been killed during the war. I'll note that he's not recognized as a fallen soldier, David Libi. Before they go in to do this task, they sign off on a document that says that they're carrying out work on behalf of the defense ministry, and if they are killed or hurt in Gaza, then they're not recognized as a fallen soldier or anything like that. So, it's a bit of a strange situation because they are carrying out military activity. They're carrying out operations for the army during army operations, but yet they're not recognized as a fallen soldier, even though in the case of Libi, he was killed by an explosive device that had been planted there by Hamas operatives previously.
Okay, let's go to a short break.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride. Just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that, in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that. The fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life, and I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up, and how we grew up here. It's just, I think, once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. Once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values. It took me a long time. It took me a long time to get there.
And we're back. We heard reports over the weekend that the Israel Air Force has struck Syria again, the coastal town of Latakia. So, Manny, of course, these strikes have been carried out over the past 19 months, but specifically, most essentially after the fall of the Assad regime. But in the past month or so, I don't believe we've been hearing so much about airstrikes on Syria. What do you know about this?
Yeah, this was the first strike since very early May. I think May 4th or 5th, if I'm not mistaken. was the last Israeli strike in Syria, and also most of the strikes have been in the Damascus area, sometimes in the east, where the former Syrian regime had these air bases that Israel targeted several times, not really on the coast, in Latakia and Tartus and those kind of areas. Israel says that it targeted anti-aircraft missile components and several weapon depots that contained anti-ship missiles, and the IDF said that the missiles posed a threat to the freedom of naval navigation, both international and Israeli, in the area. Perhaps some other group was going to take control of these missiles and potentially launch them at Israeli ships in the Mediterranean Sea. The army was a bit vague about that. I don't think they were accusing the new Syrian regime of threatening Israel, but definitely, the Latakia area especially is sort of the Alawite area. Bashar al-Assad's sort of people were from there, so perhaps some other organization is trying to gain control in that area. It's very unclear.
It is actually really interesting what you're saying, because in the past, I believe the army has said flat out that it was for Hezbollah, that they're going to be taken over by Hezbollah. And the fact that there is this kind of doubt is really unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, the army is usually very clear as to who's sort of responsible and who they're targeting. It was a bit vague this time. And again, a very unusual and I guess rare strike. It's the first time in a month. And it also comes when Israel is, they're holding direct negotiations. I mean, reportedly, but at least the Syrian side has said this flat out, that Israel and Syria are talking, and they've established some sort of connection here to try and de-escalate. And the sort of Syrian president, Ahmad al-Shara, has said that he doesn't want to see Israel and Syria fighting with each other. I don't think he said he wants peace with Israel, but definitely to stop the fighting, because it's in everyone's interest to sort of calm the tensions in the region.
Okay, let's close with a really fascinating new technology that we've discussed in a different iteration in the past. I'm talking about the iron beam, which eventually will be beaming down from the heavens in order to take out all sorts of different projectiles. But apparently the IDF has been testing it out, beta testing live on Hezbollah drones over the past, not since the ceasefire, I would imagine, but before the ceasefire with the Hezbollah in Lebanon in November 27th. So tell us about this. How are they calling this different iteration of this laser technology?
I've seen a couple names float around, but I'm not sure if it's actually the name. So that's why we didn't actually include it. It's basically a lower powered version of the iron beam, which is the iron beam is, I think, like very, very high powered, and this one is sort of slightly lower powered. So it's sort of the one that they're testing out right now, because the iron beam is still not completed and fully ready yet. It is set to be delivered to the IDF actually later this year. I'm not sure if it'll be operational yet, but it will be delivered for sort of the initial testing. But basically during the war, during the fighting last year, Hezbollah fired, I think, more than 300 explosive drones at Israel and several more surveillance drones. And many of them, I think at least half of them, actually got through Israeli air defenses in the beginning. And the Iron Dome and fighter jets and helicopters were really struggling to shoot them down, because Hezbollah was getting, I guess, quite good at getting them through and hitting targets. We saw, of course, one drone hit Netanyahu's residence in Caesarea. Another hit the Golani training base, if you remember, in October, and killed 4 soldiers. So because of these sort of incidents, the army was trying to find any solution possible to dealing with the drones, and that's where the defense ministry and Rafael, the defense firm, stepped in and basically gave the army this in development, lower powered version of the Iron Beam to basically test it out. And this one actually worked quite well. Podcast exclusive, they shot down 35 of the drones.
Wow. Okay, everyone, just pause and understand that was a podcast exclusive.
Yeah,
okay,
no,
35 drones.
The army said initially dozens, but we were able to confirm afterwards that it was indeed 35 that they shot down using the laser system. They've also tried to use it on rockets and mortars as well, but the lower powered version was, I think, less successful with that. But mainly drones, and basically it shoots a laser beam at the drone, and it burns usually the wing or the engine of it, and it causes it to crash to the ground. It's not very short. It takes a few seconds to do so, and it causes the drone to crash, which is also could be problematic because it can crash over an area where it could harm someone or infrastructure or anything. But I will note that this is the unit that's launching or using this laser system is the new air defense battalion that we spoke about in the podcast actually not long ago. And I mentioned there that maybe they're using a laser system, so we can say now that they are indeed using the laser system. And this
is a mixed gender unit, isn't it, Manny?
Correct, yeah. It's the 946th Air Defense Battalion. It was reopened, revived to now operate anti-drone systems. So it's using the laser system, and it's also using a new gun-based system. It's basically a heavy machine gun that fires lots of bullets, which can also shoot down drones very effectively, not at very long ranges. Even the laser system is not very effective at long ranges. But for small areas, if you're trying to protect an army base or a critical infrastructure, a power station or something like that, then these sort of systems are very effective to basically defend a small area from any drones approaching.
It sounds almost like a fly zapper. Forgive me if I'm being a little flip, but I would imagine that after it's actually built and, the prototypes and all the first, mechanisms will be very expensive. But I imagine that after that, it will be actually so much cheaper to run than the projectile-based systems that we've been mostly known for until now.
Yeah, for sure. It's way, way cheap. And that's, I think, when our Prime Minister was Naftali Bennett, and he said that this was his vision at the time. This was, several years ago. And he said this was his vision for intercepting rockets from Gaza. It would be, instead of costing tens of thousands of dollars per Iron Dome interceptor, it would be a fraction of the price to launch this laser system. But I think it's important to put it in the context of this isn't going to replace the Iron Dome, not now at least, and maybe not even in the next 10 years, purely because the range isn't as far and it's not it's a bit slower than Interceptor, but it's supposed to work alongside of it, in tandem basically, and it can save, hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of dollars if lots of projectiles are being launched or lots of drones are being launched. It's hard to intercept all of them. It's definitely going to be a huge economic sort of help. But it won't replace any of the existing systems, that's for sure. Maybe in the future when we have space lasers and we're shooting down Houthi ballistics missiles with space lasers, then it will replace the arrow. But I think that's like sort of way, way, way far off.
I've heard, according to some American politicians, that we already do have some Jewish space lasers.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Manny, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.